Brain Development and Plasticity. How does the brain change? Presentation by Tammy Jeffs, professional engineer and certified professional coach. Objectives. To get started in our understanding of brain plasticity, we will begin with some background on the human nervous system and how information is detected and signals sent at the cellular level. Next, neuroplasticity will be defined so that we can understand how it works and why it is such a brilliant concept to understand and apply. In particular, the focus will be on the ability of the adult brain to change. To demonstrate, we will investigate some practical and positive influences on neuroplasticity and how they can support recovery from damage as well as support optimal functioning. Finally, we will conclude to summarize our learnings as well as connect neuroplasticity to the biopsychosocial approach to professional psychology as it relates to counseling. The human nervous system. As you know, the nervous system is a system of nerves in your body that sends and receives messages for controlling movement and feeling between the brain and other parts of the body. The body's response to stimuli is controlled by the brain, spinal cord, nerves, and ganglia. Signals are transmitted by neurons, which are structurally supported by glial cells. The neurons transmit electrical and chemical signals. Glial cells provide a structural framework for the neurons while actively regulating the brain biochemistry and repairing damage to the central nervous system. Let's take a closer look. Here we see a sensory neuron, which senses stimuli and collects this information. Neurons have dendrites that act as receptors, obtaining information from other cells. The information is then transmitted from the dendritic tree through to the cell body and along to the axon and the terminal branches. The terminal branches of the axons form connections with other neurons or muscle or gland cells at junctions called synapses. Thus, information is transmitted from the neuron to the central nervous system, that is, to the brain and spinal cord. We discussed sensory neurons in the previous slide and their function to collect information from a given stimuli. This slide shows the connection of these sensory neurons with interneurons and motor neurons. Interneurons enable communication between sensory or motor neurons and the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. Motor neurons then send signals from the central nervous system to the muscles to provide a response. So in simple terms, the sensory neurons would detect a stimuli, for example, a hot stove. This message would be passed along to the interneurons and then to the spinal cord and brain, the central nervous system. A signal would then be provided to the motor neurons to remove your hand from the stove. This happens so quickly, it appears to be an automatic response. Let's keep this in mind for our exploration of neuroplasticity. As we will find, responses such as these provide us with protection from our environment. It's like our fight and flight responses. As you will see, there is brilliance and power in proactive or intentional conscious movement, actions, and thoughts. Neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to change and adapt in response to its input. This can be achieved by the formation of new neurons and glial cells through cell division or the elimination of these cells, apoptosis. New circuits can be formed, existing synaptic connections can be strengthened or weakened, dendrites can be remodeled, and new axons created. For example, when there is damage to the brain, reorganization takes place to adjust and repair the damage. This can be achieved by axon sprouting, where damaged neuron links are reconnected by a new growth of new axon nerve endings. This can effectively establish new connections and new neural pathways to achieve what was an impaired function. Adult neurogenesis, the growth of dendritic spines and synaptic modifications, are all a part of neuroplasticity and are fundamental elements that support healthy functioning. By contrast, irregular neural production, connectivity, or transmission is present in such things as Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, depression, strokes, etc. The brilliant advantage of being faced with major challenges or changes is that our brain can adapt by remodeling and refining existing connections to respond. For instance, brain injuries or strokes and abuse of substances may result in a loss of synapses, retraction of dendrites, called debranching, and pruning of axons, thereby reducing communication in those areas. A neurogenetic hypothesis of depression suggests that reduced adult neurogenesis in the hippocampus may be the cause of depression, while the ability to produce the desired antidepressant requires an increased response to the hippocampal neurogenesis. In time, the axons can sprout as well as prune to re-establish connections and effectively repair some functioning. Thus, neuroplasticity is significant to support cognitive rehabilitation from any situation where our neurogenesis has been inhibited. As you can see, neuroplasticity is incredibly significant to every individual's health. Neurons integrate and transmit numerous signals to process and synthesize information, ultimately supporting bodily health. Neurons continually form, eliminate, and modify connections. So now you are curious and wondering, how can I encourage my brain or my client's brain to positively adapt and change to create new connections and strengthen existing connections or to repair existing damage? There is evidence that we can influence, stimulate, and accelerate the repair and strengthening of our neurological functions. Treatment and studies for stroke patients have demonstrated that drugs that stimulate the availability of the hormone norepinephrine support movement, recovery, and rehabilitation. These drugs promote and encourage the nerve synapses to generate additional connections. Norepinephrine is a chemical released from the sympathetic nervous system in response to stress. It is a chemical that is released from neurons, so classified as a neurotransmitter. Norepinephrine is naturally released by the body in response to stress and reacts to increase the release of oxygen to the brain, increases the heart rate, and stimulates glucose release, so you have the increased availability to fight or flee. Due to the cost and potential side effects, it's worth exploring some more natural options to drugs, ones that produce the same results. So let's examine some natural, positive influences on brain changes. Studies have shown neuroplastic improvements in healthy human brains can result from simple learning exercises. For instance, transcranial magnetic stimulation, which maps our motor cortex, displayed an observable increase in cortical representation with task practice. That is, simple, physical, repetitive movement of muscle groups increased neural connections to support task performance. And to provide support for positive mental thoughts, when the task was practiced by thought alone, similar results were found. So in simple terms, mentally rehearsing that hole-in-one can be as effective as actually getting on the golfing greens and physically practicing the game. To provide you with some physical evidence, the first picture shown here demonstrates that meditation, intentional thought, activates additional brain activity and stimulates different areas of the brain. Similarly, the next picture shows the brain activity of 20 students after taking the same test. The difference was that those who took the test following exercise have brain scans that show increased brain activity. So what's the lesson learned? Conscious movement and conscious thought result in neuroplastic improvement. Research led by Jenny Nyberg, PhD of the Center for Brain Repair and Rehabilitation at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, investigated to see if early onset dementia was linked to cardiovascular and cognitive function. The study included more than 1 million Swedish men whom, at age 18, had mental and physical exams as a part of their military conscription process. They were followed on average for 26 years to determine who developed early onset dementia. Data from the Swedish National Hospital discharge register showed a clear correlation that below average cardiovascular function or cognitive performance at age 18 were linked with an increased risk of early onset dementia. Furthermore, individuals that had poor functioning in both these areas were 7 times more likely to develop early onset dementia than men with strong cardiovascular and cognitive performance. So, lesson learned here: long-term conscious movement and conscious thought support long-term neurological health. So let's explore conscious thought a little more. In 1949, a significant principle for changing brain circuitry was put forward by Canadian psychologist Donald Hebb. He was remembered for his quote, "What fires together, wires together." That is to say, that synaptic connections are strengthened moment by moment in time. Learning, then, is achieved through changes in neuron connections that are amplified in strength by synaptogenesis. So as one learns a skill or ability, the synapses in any directly engaged cortical zone increases in strength together. Next, let's delve deeper into conscious movement. For some background, to understand how movement can result in changes to the brain, we will start with the diagram of the homunculus. The homunculus is commonly used today in psychology to describe the distorted scale model of a human in relation to the location and amount of cortical area dedicated to a particular function. Shown on the diagram is a sensory cortex, also known as the sensory homunculus, and the motor cortex, the motor homunculus. This is significant as magnetic source imaging can show the cortical representation of a body part, such as a hand, or a sense, such as audio. Here are 3 examples of studies that demonstrate how intentional movement can positively change your brain. In all cases, the magnetic source imaging clearly showed changes in the cortical representation of the afflicted area. Case study number 1. Constraint-induced movement therapy demonstrates that an event such as a stroke, which damages the central nervous system and results in impairment to motor function, can be significantly improved even years after the injury. Many patients naturally practice a learned non-use of an impaired function, perhaps on one side of the body as the other simply works better. Unfortunately, with non-use, the impaired function does not get the practice to repair itself. As such, intentional use of the impaired function shows observable changes in the function and structure of the brain, and these changes correlate with the magnitude of the improvement in motor function that the treatment produces. So, lesson learned: if you don't use it, you lose it. Neurology works both ways. It can positively repair, and it can also lose connections if they are not practiced. Case study number 2. If you play a musical instrument, this will interest you. Magnetic source imaging reveals that string instrument players have an increased or otherwise changed cortical representation of the hand which performs the complex task of fingering the strings. The other hand, however, which by practice requires less dexterity, does not. Case study number 3. Blind people who employed 3 fingers on a hand simultaneously to read Braille demonstrate a significantly enlarged hand on the cortex area compared to a non-sighted Braille reading individual. Furthermore, blind individuals also show an enlargement in the cortex auditory area. This correlates with their enhanced sensitivity to localized sounds and their reliance on sound for guided orientation and movement. The hippocampus is a region in the brain known to extensively regulate learning, memory, and mood. This area is also known for its ability to continually regenerate new neurons throughout one's life in a process known as adult hippocampal neurogenesis. Functionally, adult hippocampal neurogenesis, or AHN, is directly linked to cognitive and emotional regulation, and it is fundamental to supporting learning and reducing anxiety and depressive behaviors. So let's explore some of the factors shown to induce changes in AHN as well as in the neurons themselves. As mentioned previously, stress impacts our brain functions. Animal studies have revealed that chronic stress reduces the dendritic tree of the hippocampal neurons. As also mentioned, voluntary exercise has been extensively shown to encourage and enhance neurogenesis. So what about dietary habits and our calorie intake? Caloric reduction appears to both improve the resilience of synapses to metabolic and oxidative damage, as well as regulate the number, structure, and function of neural connections. Caloric restriction moderates the levels of glutamate receptors and synaptic proteins thought to support hippocampal-dependent learning and memory. Studies show that maintaining rodents on calorie-reduced diets prevents age-related reductions in learning, as well as promoting spatial and working memory. Furthermore, these studies show that lifetime regimes of caloric reduction support positive effects in combating age-related processes, and even caloric reduction later in life demonstrates beneficial effects. I was hopeful to find some quantitative evidence that would demonstrate that sleep also has a positive effect on supporting brain changes and repair. It appears that empirical evidence is lacking in this area, and it will be an opportunity for future analysis. What was documented was qualitative information that likely resonates with us all based on a practical personal experience. With a background that includes nuclear engineering, however, I can assure you that words like seems to and suggest don't hold much weight in the scientific or technical community. In any case, here are some documented observations. Sleep seems to restore synaptic plasticity, with positive effects on the learning process. Sleep deprivation induces changes in the strengthening of synapses, increases cortical excitability, and has negative consequence on learning. Growing evidence suggests that sleep may be useful to restore synaptic plasticity in different pathological conditions. Since plastic processes are essential for functioning recovery, a proper sleep management regime and reduction in sleep disturbances could be beneficial for rehabilitation. Connection to the biopsychosocial approach. In collecting this research material, I experienced an aha moment that unified the investigation for me. The science of fractals brought it all together. Fractals are defined by Wikipedia as a natural phenomenon or a mathematical set that exhibits a repeating pattern that displays at every scale. It strikes me that we have a massive opportunity to influence our well-being at various scales: the universe, global, national, community, individual, and even cellular level. Patterns repeat and mimic themselves at various levels. Most readily available to control are our physical bodies and to what we choose to expose ourselves to. These exposures can consider the dimensions of the biopsychosocial model. Specifically, we must consider the impact of these elements on our body's well-being and how this translates or mimics itself on other levels. When we consider biological factors, we know that exercise, nutrition, sleep, chemicals, etc. have the ability to produce positive or negative changes. Likewise, from a psychological perspective, we can follow logic or emotions that can support and repair our health, or alternatively, destruct it. From a social cultural perspective, we can create strength and connection with others, or erect barriers of isolation. The first step is awareness, as health depends on connection, and connection at all levels. Although diagnosis is key to understanding the steps to positively support health and well-being, we must also recognize that as we humans are all similar, we all experience disconnection, and we must not isolate those individuals that have experienced neurological disconnection. Rather, we need to support them to regain connection and to regain health at all levels. There is science to prove this can be accomplished. Conclusions. It is evident that neuroplasticity has significant implications to the best practices for a holistic approach for treatment in neurological and psychiatric medicine. The ability of our brain to change, even in adult life, to adapt to our surroundings, provides much hope for individuals who require rehabilitation or others that simply desire to achieve optimal functioning. Associated therapy is in its infancy, and still it's evident that addressing neurological concerns proactively, as well as treating neurological distortions directly, can produce significant results. As we continue to understand more about how the brain responds to stimulus and reorganizes itself, we can gain further understanding of how to treat neurological afflictions. Harnessing the intrinsic plasticity functions, we can also create habits that increase our resilience to diseases as well as expedite recovery cycles. It is exciting to know that we can positively influence our own well-being as well as provide support to others that can benefit from the science. Even more exciting, the journey to understanding neuroplasticity has only just begun.